Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast.
During the reign of Caliph Vathek, a young man of good repute and family, named Nuruddin Hassan, was hauled before the Qadi Alimed ben Bekar at Basura. Now Nuruddin was a comely youth, of open mind and gentle mien, and great was the astonishment of the Qadi and of all others present when they heard the charges that were preferred against him. He was accused of having slain 7 people, one by one, on 7 successive nights, and of having left the corpses in a cemetery near Basura, where they were found lying with their bodies and members devoured in a fearsome manner, as if by jackals. Of the people he was said to have slain, 3 were women, 2 were travelling merchants, 1 was a mendicant, and 1 was a gravedigger.
Greetings and welcome to Season 2, Episode 7 of Strange Shadows, the Clark Ashton Smith podcast. The voice you heard there was writer and game designer Mr. Paul Fricker reading an excerpt of the first story that we're going to be covering today. I'm your host, Tim Mendes.
And I'm your other host, Rob Ployton. Yes, whether you're an old romantic, a new romantic, or a necromantic, you're in the right place. With 2 great stories today, short stories, but these are real crackers.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The first one that we're going to be covering, The Ghoul, I'd read before because it's in the Clark Ashton cycle, the Chaosium collection of his mythos stories. I'd read it before, but it was a long time ago, and I'd forgotten how good it was. But the second one I hadn't actually read before. And it was, yeah, I love it. It's now shot to like my top 10 Clark Ashton Smith stories. There's something about it I really like.
Yeah, the same here. That's definitely a favourite of everything we've read so far, which is saying something.
Yeah,
really.
definitely. Yeah, I think it's the atmosphere. It's just, yeah. Well, we'll get to it in a moment, won't we? But yeah, great.
We did just want to mention before we start as well that following requests, we have set up a Discord server. Now, there's a Discord server in operation already for the Innsmouth Literary Festival. So we've added is it a room or a channel? I'm so behind on this tech.
I think it's called a room.
Grandad.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just as clueless as you are.
So we've added a room in there for chat for both Strange Shadows and the Innsmouth Book Club. And what we're hoping is obviously people will engage through that. It also helps us a bit as it keeps all your messages in one place. I think one thing we find at the moment is sometimes we miss messages because they might be on a Facebook group somewhere we've posted or a mention on YouTube. Basically, before every episode, we have to check all these different places. So if we could keep everything on the Discord chat, that would be great. And of course, there you can respond to each other as well. So I hope we can get some lively conversations going.
Yeah, it'd be nice. Discord seems to be sort of taking off at the minute, doesn't it? It's I think it's the old school chat room style thing. It seems to be quite attractive to people who are a bit bored of things like Facebook, I think. But we'll see how it goes.
Yes.
I mean, by all means, still post it other places. It's just,
Oh, sure.
It'd be nice to just be nice to get some conversation going, really. Nice to interact with you guys.
And of course, you can always email us directly at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com if you have any questions of a personal nature. Okay, so shall we get into our favourite words then to kick things off?
Indeed, yeah. I had a couple in the first one. I only had a couple. The first one was... I'd heard it, and I knew it, but it's one of those that's just another word for waning, basically. Decrescent. So Decrescent Moon, which is a waning moon. I thought it'd be a great band name, the Decrescent Moon.
Yes. I think in here there weren't really any words that I didn't know the meaning of, but there are a few nice sounding ones. There were one or two. One word that I always like the sound of is mendicant.
Yes.
Which people often say it's a beggar, but strictly speaking, it's more a person who lives off of alms.
Yeah.
So there's normally a religious connotation to that, like a monk or something like that.
Yeah, pilgrims. It's like I recently went to an almshouse, just outside of Winchester, where they filmed they filmed the remake of Day of the Triffids. And that's mendicants welcome and things like that, you know. So yeah, my second one, again, it's a word I know, but I just like the sound of it, is connubial, which means connected by marriage.
That is a good word. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had a word that I thought I knew. In fact, I did. It was easy to work out the meaning from the context. Condole, which is very rarely used. And of course, it just means sympathy.
Mm.
And then after I looked at that, I thought, well, of course, condolences. You see condolences, but that's the first time I've ever seen condole like that, I think.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think it is one of those that's fallen out of favour, isn't it? It's like placate is another one that similar kind of thing, but you rarely hear it used these days.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Moving on to the second story. My first one is a word I'm very familiar with, but I love it, is penumbral, which is the plural of of penumbra, which is the partially shaded outer region of a shadow cast by an opaque object. It can also mean a peripheral or indeterminate area or group, and it's also the name of a video game series by Fictional Games, which was who are better known for the brilliant cosmic horror games Amnesia.
Nice.
There you go.
And there was another word I was familiar with, but in a different context, because at one time I used to work at a Crown Court, and that word was interdicted, as in interdict or interdiction, which in this context means forbidden, but it's quite often used in legal terms as well.
I missed that one because I'm not actually familiar with that.
Yeah. Interdict or interdict, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, which comes as no surprise to regular listeners.
Yeah, my final one is cerastes, which is a genus of horned viper from North Africa. And it's also a horned serpent in Greek myth with ram's horns. Oh,
interesting. I didn't know that. And one word that I certainly didn't know, and again, apologies for pronunciation, simoon or simoon, I think it's simoon, which is an Arabic word for poison wind.
That's a good one.
That's apparently where the wind is so hot across the desert that it doesn't cool you down, but it actually takes moisture out of you, actually sort of dehydrates you.
Oh, that'd be horrible, wouldn't it, that?
Yes. Great. So those are our words for this time. So these two, well, the Ghoul especially is only a few pages long.
Yeah.
But we've got a lot packed in here. So shall we start with our publication history?
It was completed on November the 11th, 1930. Farnsworth Wright, surprise, surprise, rejected it for both weird tales and Oriental stories. Oriental stories at the time wasn't accepting weird. It was too weird for Oriental and not weird enough for weird tales. I don't know. It's.
I mean, it's Oriental, but this is not a. I suppose it is a weird story in a sense, but it's drawing on Oriental, or well, let's call it Oriental for the moment, or certainly Arabic folklore. So, Farnsworth Wright was a strange guy.
Yeah, he was like changeable as the weather, I think, sometimes. It was also rejected by ghost stories. But again, this is another running theme. The editor really liked it, but it wasn't a fit. Right. We've said that about the last like 6 or 7 stories, got rejected by ghost stories because it wasn't a fit, but the guy really liked it. So, in the end, Smith ended up giving it away to the Fantasy Fan, which was a fanzine, and it was published in the January 1934 issue. So, yeah, he didn't receive a penny for that.
Well, that's a shame.
Which is a real shame. Got some interesting interaction here between Clark Asher Smith and H.P. Lovecraft. Smith sent it to Lovecraft, depicting it as a legend so hideous that I will not be surprised if there was some mention of it in the Necronomicon. Will you verify this for me? Lovecraft's response was in the same spirit. Oh, yes, Abdul mentioned your ghoul and told of other adventures of his, but some timid reader has torn out the pages where the episode of the vault under the mosque comes to a climax. The deletion being curiously uniform in the copies at Harvard and at Miskatonic University. When I wrote to the University of Paris for information about the missing text, a polite sub-librarian, Mr. Leon de Vriches, wrote to me that he would make a photostatic copy as soon as he could comply with the formalities attendant upon access to the dreaded volume. You take a breath now.
That's beautiful. So I just love the way these two, that goes beyond
Yeah.
oh, you mentioned my Necronomicon into like almost a complete other story in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And then later, in a more serious note, Lovecraft praised the story as possessing the Arabian Nights atmosphere to perfection, both in content and language. And if Wright is in his senses, he will snap it up for Oriental stories. It savours completely of the Beckford Vathek period and of the banks of the Tigris itself. And then Farnsworth Wright rejected it.
Yes, of course he did. Of course he did.
This is what I love about their interactions, specifically Smith and Lovecraft. That they're just having fun, aren't they? You know.
They seem to do that a lot more than the other authors. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
I've read something of the Howard and Lovecraft letters, and they get into quite detailed discussions about various topics. But they're friendly. They argue with each other. They disagree, but it's all very friendly and there's a mutual respect. But I don't seem to get that same sort of, from the vaults of the nethermost depths of whatever on the third day. I don't see a lot of that. Perhaps it is there, but I just haven't seen it yet. Yeah, but these two are they're just having fun with it, aren't they?
It's banter, isn't it? It's like the same with Clark Ashton Smith and August Derleth. I mean, their stuff is very sort of business. They do go off on tangents, but it's usually talking about horror and tropes and poetry and same with Loveman. But then when you get to the letters of Smith and Lovecraft, they're from the abominable pits of the Shoggoths.
Wednesday. As we heard in the opening there, this story takes place during the reign of the Caliph Vathek. Now, Smith is having a little joke with his readers here, perhaps, because, as I'm sure aficionados of the genre will know, Vathek was one of the very first Gothic novels. It was actually written in French originally in 1782 by William Beckford, and it was translated into English in 1786 by the Reverend Samuel Henley, who actually changed the title to An Arabian Tale and made no mention of William Beckford, the author. Naughty Reverend.
Plagiarist Reverend. There we go.
So Beckford, of course, drew on the Arabian Nights, as so many of our favourite authors did at that time. And the Arabian Nights have been translated by Antoine Galland in 1708. And Beckford combined the Arabian Nights influence with Voltaire and also Walpole's Castle of Otranto, which most people regard as the very first Gothic novel. That came out in 1764. So we've got this sort of mix of the European Gothic and the Arabian Nights, which is quite an interesting mix in this book. And it describes the fall from power of the Caliph Vathek, who renounced Islam and delved into the occult. Basically, it's a bit of a Faustian story, really. He was looking for eternal life. And that book itself has been a huge influence on people like Byron, Poe, Lovecraft, Smith, H.G. Wells. And Vathek is where we see the first use of the word ghoul in English literature. So, if you like, this is the source for all future ghoul stories.
Nice. I don't think I've ever read it. I must rectify that. Is it the original spelling of ghoul, the G-H-U-L, or the sort of anglicised spelling?
I think it's the anglicised. I'm not sure what it is in the original French version. That might be something different. Because, the Arabic word is G-H-U-L, which is said to come from the word gala, meaning to seize. And the Gala were, well, they can go back to Mesopotamian legend and myth.
Yeah.
They were desert-dwelling, shape-shifting demons. And I think our perception of ghouls nowadays, certainly from a Lovecraftian perspective, is a little different. I think he took the idea and ran with it and expanded upon it. But originally, they dwelt in the desert wastes where they lured unwary travellers to their doom. They also ate the dead, of course, which, I mean, now ghouls seem to exclusively feed on the dead. That seems to be their thing. But this is one thing that I really liked. They would take the form of the person most recently eaten. So I thought there's a nice story in there, isn't it, where someone dies and then they come back. But that's actually the ghoul that ate their corpse.
That's cool. Yeah.
So, of course, Smith was very well aware of the Arabian Nights and presumably had read Vathek as well, which, so I guess that's the direct influence for this story.
Nice. Yeah, just before we get into it, it's interesting talking about that because I mentioned when I said about Penumbra, about fictional games, their Amnesia series, which is a series of cosmic horror video games. I mean, most famously Amnesia: The Dark Descent. And they're all linked by a new sort of mythos that they created. It's Lovecraftian without Lovecraft, you know? But the third game in the series, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago, Amnesia Rebirth, is set in the desert and it has ghouls in it. And they're talking about, and it's got the original spelling and it's got a lot of the original folklore in it. So basically, you're going around these temple ruins being chased by ghouls, and it's tremendous. I'm actually replaying it at the minute for research. It's tremendous fun. And yeah, it's really funny. It was just like one of those sort of serendipity moments that I'm playing at the moment. Then we got into this, and I was like, oh, blimey, you know, I hadn't realised how much that game had taken of that sort of the original folkloric ghoul as opposed to Lovecraftian ghoul.
Yeah, or even later on, as we'll talk about at the end, of course, there's been a few films called The Ghoul, one of which we'll directly reference. And none of those have that same background, do they, really?
No.
It's generally, they're sort of, it just seems to be eaters of the dead, pretty much.
Yeah.
So the setup of the story is that during the reign of the Caliph Vathek, this young man, Nureddin Hassan, has been brought before the Qadi Ahmed Ben Bakar at Bussorah. A Qadi, by the way, is a judge. That's just the word for a judge. And this young man is accused of murdering 7 people. Not just murdering, but horribly mutilating them as well.
Having left their corpses in a cemetery near Bussorah, where they were found lying afterwards with their bodies and members devoured in a fearsome manner, as if by jackals. So yeah, you got the feeling of sort of an Arabian Jack the Ripper kind of thing going on here.
Yeah. And Smith doesn't shy away from, I mean, it's not particularly graphic, but it's gruesome, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah.
Now, this sort of puzzles the judge, Ahmed Ben Bakar. Is a man filled with learning and the wisdom of honourable years, and he's deeply perplexed by the atrocity of the crimes, but the fact that the accused is a very mild-mannered, well-bred young man. The two things don't seem to fit together.
Yeah, he's described as a comely youth of open mind and gentle mien. So yeah, it's sort of an all-round nice chap.
Yeah.
But that brings to mind a lot of like the serial killers, because it's like you always get them news reports, don't they? Oh, he was such a lovely, quiet man. He was really nice. You know?
He was always nice to his mother.
Yeah. We all go a little bad sometimes. Yeah.
And I think to this judge's credit, he questions the young man about this. You sort of get the thing at this stage, they could just execute him or throw him in jail or whatever. But I think the judge senses there's a story here. And he says to Nureddin, "Thou hast been charged with crimes of exceeding foulness, which thy bearing and thy lineaments belie. Is there haply an explanation of these things by which thou canst wholly clear thyself, or in some measure mitigate the heinousness of thy deeds, if so it be that thou art guilty? I adjure thee to tell me the truth in this matter." Now, it becomes very apparent from reading that Smith here is very consciously using what he called old-fashioned language.
Yes. Yeah. And Hassan replies, "Alas, O Qadi, for the charges that have been brought against me are indeed true. It was I, and none other, who slew these people, nor can I offer an extenuation of my act."
And this confuses the judge even more because he's confessed to these murders, but has given absolutely no motivation at all.
Mm.
And it takes some pressing from the judge to get the story out of the young man. And it turns out that basically what has happened is this young man was living an enjoyable and fulfilled life. He was married to Amina, the daughter of a jewel merchant. They were very much in love, and they were anticipating the birth of their first child. He's inherited a big estate from his father, so money is not an issue. He's married to the woman of his dreams, and a first child is on the way. This is like the opening to one of those stories, isn't it? You know that something's going to go wrong. Usually it's a guy who's ex-special forces. And, you know.
It's your classic action movie setup, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, specifically, it's Commando, the Schwarzenegger movie, isn't it?
Pretty much every Steven Seagal or whatever.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, his wife Amina dies in childbirth and is interred in the local cemetery.
And Hassan says, "After the burial of my Amina, my sorrow became a veritable madness, and I wandered by night to her grave in the cemetery near Basura, and flung myself prostrate before the newly lettered tombstone on the earth that had been digged that very day. My senses deserted me, and I knew not how long I remained on the damp clay beneath the cypresses, while the horn of a decrescent moon arose in the heavens." Beautiful language, that. Yeah.
And as he's laying there, prostrate in his grief, he hears a strange voice. And lifting my head a little, I saw a hideous demon of gigantic frame and stature, with eyes of scarlet fire beneath brows that were as coarse as tangled rootlets, and fangs that overhung a cavernous mouth, and earth-black nails that were longer and sharper than those of the hyena. So we get quite a full-on description of this creature, and I suppose this could be a Lovecraftian ghoul. It's not that different in the description there.
I see them as the descendants. I see the Lovecraft ghoul as basically like the modern descendants of, because they do have a lot of the same characteristics. It's just like they've kind of almost civilized themselves to a degree, you know, to get by in Western culture, I guess. But from a physiological standpoint, they've got the dog face and the, you know.
And this creature is quite open. It says, "I am a ghoul, and it is my office to devour the bodies of the dead." His office, that's like his job. Someone employs him to eat the dead.
Yeah. You can imagine the advert in the local paper, can't you? "Call your friendly neighbourhood ghoul."
I just wonder, he got the short straw in the job centre, didn't he? You know, so someone got to work in Tesco's and someone got to work on a building site. You're going to Basura to eat the dead. And of course, a body has just gone in, so it's his job to come in and dig it up.
Obviously, Hassan isn't happy about this. So, "Spare this grave, I implore thee, for she that lies buried therein is dearer to me than any living mortal, and I would not that her fair body should be the provender of an unclean demon such as thou."
Which pisses the ghoul off a little bit. I suppose it's a little bit rude, isn't it?
It was a bit rude, yeah, calling him an unclean demon. The poor chap's just doing his job, you know.
And things look like they're going to get a bit physical, a bit violent. But the young man then swears by Allah and Muhammad with many solemn oaths. Basically, he will do anything to prevent his ex-wife being treated in this way. So the ghoul says, "If thou wilt indeed perform for me a certain service, I shall do as thou askest."
Now, my dirty mind went down the wrong corridor there.
you and me both, because again, this is Clark Ashton Smith, and Graveyard Rumpy Pumpy is not unknown.
Yes, it's not out of the realms of possibility, is it?
But well, you can decide if it's better or worse than what he is actually asked to do, I suppose. Basically, the ghoul says if he brings him each night for 8 successive nights the body of one whom thou hast slain with thine own hand, if he does this, I shall neither devour nor dig the body, that lies interred hereunder. So it's being set up here to murder 8 people and bring them to the ghoul.
Yeah. Obviously, he tries to, negotiate. Is it needful, O eater of corpses, that the bodies should be those of people who I myself have slain? And the ghoul basically says, yeah. For all the others would be the natural provender of myself or of my kin in any event. So basically, it's like, well, that's not really a deal, is it? Because if they were just dead people, I'd eat them anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I like that, O eater of corpses, as well. That's a great sobriquet,
isn't it? Yeah.
I wonder here if the ghoul, because he could just say to him, oh, if you can find us a few bodies, bring them here, stick them on a wheelbarrow. But there's actually this condition, you have to slay these people yourself. Is this pulling this man to the dark side? It's causing him to sin in some way. So does this act sort of bring him into the ghoul sphere of influence in some other way, or is his soul imperiled by it?
Yeah, just not a great idea. Yeah, because Burke and Hare, they were grave robbers, and they took the bodies to the medical thing, and then all of a sudden they started killing people. Ghoul deal.
Yeah, there it is.
Maybe the doctor wasn't a doctor. Maybe he was a ghoul.
Yes.
I'm right.
I think perhaps a ghoul anthology might be on the cards. Yeah. I do like writing ghoul stories. I have to say I've written a couple. Always enjoy them.
Yeah, I do. I
think they're the most human of the Lovecraft monsters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're more deep ones. They're kind of, they're like humanity's cousins, I guess.
Yeah, they're tribal, aren't they? We can understand their motivations. And communicate with both of them as well.
And in the case of deep ones, mingle.
Yes, well, I wasn't going to go there, but I'm glad you did.
Again, from the stars to the gutter.
So that sets him off on this murderous spree, and across 7 nights, he kills. This is totally random. His killing, right? He basically hangs out by the cemetery, and the first person that comes along when it gets dark, he sort of bashes their head in or cuts their throat or however he does it.
Yeah, it is man, woman, merchant, beggar, grave digger, pretty much, complete crimes of opportunity. So he's getting no pleasure from it. It's mechanical. It's this has to be done. Wrong place, wrong time, wallop, basically.
But at the last minute now, just as his task is almost done, he's been captured. Of course, he's got one more night or one more person to slay. Alas, for these lamentable crimes have availed me not, and I have failed in wholly keeping my bargain with the demon, who will doubtless this very night consume the body of Amina in lieu of the one corpse that is still lacking. I resign myself to thy judgment, O Ahmed Ben Bakar, and I beseech thee for no other mercy than that of death, wherewith to terminate my double grief and my twofold remorse. And this is where I suppose the wisdom of the judge takes hold, because they've got the guy, he's confessed, they understand his motivations now. So it would be very easy to say, okay, sling him in jail, off with his head, whatever the punishment is. But the judge here, he takes his time, doesn't he, to think about this.
Yeah, he deliberates, and he said, I cannot judge thee guiltless, though I know not the punishment which is merited in a case so utterly without example or parallel. And this is where he makes his decree. Therefore I set thee free with this injunction, that thou shalt make atonement for thy crimes in the fashion that seemeth best to thee, and shalt render justice to thyself and to others in such degree as thou art able.
Nice. No, so he basically lets the young man go, much to the consternation of the other people there. Some were calling for him to be put to death on the spot. And a lot of people are questioning the Qadi's wisdom in this.
And obviously there's a bit of an uproar, but the Qadi says, wait, for this man will render justice to himself and to all others concerned as far as the rendering thereof is possible.
Yeah. But I liked all this as well within that uproar in the court. This is one of those rhubarb kind of scenes, isn't it?
Order.
And there's people telling their own stories about the habits of ghouls and the strange plight of men who have encountered ghouls. There's all this sort of buzzy gossip going on about ghouls now. Well, I knew a guy who, it just brings it to life, that kind of stuff.
It does. You can hear the clamour in your ears, can't you, when you're reading it? You can hear that low mutter you get in courts, because it is a very specific muttering you get in courts. Yeah. It's all very it's sort of furtive,
It is, yes. But, the judge is in charge, so his word is law. Yeah, and as you say, this leads us then to the last paragraph, where on the morning of the next day, another body is found in a cemetery, lying half devoured on the grave of Nureddin Hassan's wife, Amina. And the body was that of Nureddin, self-slain, who in this manner had not only fulfilled the injunction of the Qadi, but had also kept his bargain with the ghoul by providing the required number of corpses. So quite a grim ending in some ways, but also a sort of fitting end.
Yeah, it's almost like redemption through self-sacrifice. It's I really like it. Like I say, it's very short. It's very simple in a way. It's not a complex narrative at all, but there's just something about it I really like. It's almost got that feeling of your sort of your Aesop's fables or your grim fairy tales. That kind of.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. There's the man is put into a position where he has to do something wrong, but he's kind of doing something wrong for the right reasons.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, these other people have suffered, so he has to suffer in turn. But in doing that, he fulfills his side of the bargain. So there's no hangover from this, is there?
No, it's very neat.
Though presumably the ghoul is still there and digging up bodies.
Oh yeah, well, ghouls got to do what a ghoul's got to do, right?
Ghouls just want to have fun.
And ghouls just want to have. Oh no, ghouls on film.
Now, you told me off last time.
Yeah.
The tree men have been all my tree jokes. So I'll let you have that. I'll give you that one.
Ghouls on film.
Oh dear. So we've got a couple of mentions of this story in the letters between Smith and Lovecraft. You've already read one out. That letter, by the way, I did just want to read the opening, the return address. This is November 1930, and this is Lovecraft to Smith. From the burrow of it, capital letters, that stirs in the dark deep under the nighted palace of Anchar, and against which the nameless guardians of Anchar seal the yawning vault that was there before Anchar and the darkness thereof.
Oh, that's a bit good, isn't it?
That is great. And then we get that paragraph you read before. There is a nice little mention just after that as well of if Wright is in his senses, he will snap it up for Oriental Stories. But has he told you of the plan to cut expenses by making Weird Tales a bi-monthly? So that was something that was going on at the time. I guess Weird Tales was always running on a tight budget, wasn't it? So
yeah, it was. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it stayed monthly or did go bi-monthly at one point. I'm sure one of their readers can let us know. Now, later on in that letter, which goes on for several pages.
Of course it does.
As we mentioned, Smith is deliberately using what we call old-fashioned speech style there, the these and the thous, to give this story some of its atmosphere. And Lovecraft, of course, picks up on this. Your remarks on style and its importance are highly interesting and inspire my complete agreement. What a pity that 9/10 of the contents of all weird magazines is utterly devoid of that quality in any well-recognised sense. Yes, the tone of a story as established at the outset is all important. It carries both the writer and the reader onward and sets the proper atmospheric keynote by presenting the outlines of a certain mood. And then he references this story in particular. You have succeeded admirably in demodernising the ghoul. Indeed, it savours completely of the Beckford Vathek period and of the banks of the Tigris itself, as you mentioned earlier. And I wonder if this was one reason why Wright rejected it, because it was it was written in his old-fashioned language, perhaps.
I don't know. Trying to figure out the whims of Farnsworth Wright is beyond me. I'm afraid. I don't know. It's like sometimes it's like it's not weird enough, or it's too weird, or different, wrong kind of weird. I don't know. It's depends on which way the wind's blowing, I think, sometimes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I mean, Smith references this himself as well in the return letter, which is December 1930. From the sacrificial altar of the nameless gods that were and are and shall be in the space beyond space and the time beyond time. And he writes, I'm glad you like the Ghoul and Sir John, which is the next story we're going to be covering in a moment. These tales please me for their archaism, which is a quality that will not please magazine editors. Someone should write an essay on the bêtise of commercial magazines. The subject, however, is like the bottomless pit. Bêtise means foolish or foolishness. So again, it is that idea of, is this going to be too difficult for our readers to understand? Because they might not know that "the" means you or your or whatever.
Yeah.
Wright seems to consistently underestimate the intelligence of his readers.
Thing is, I've had that myself, where an edit, because I've written it was a story I'd written set in the Victorian period, so I'd used a lot of archaic terms by modern standards, and an editor was like, "Oh well, can't you know?" When I got the edit through, they changed it all to like modern terms, and it was just it just looked so weird, you know. It just looked so strange, and so I ended up having an argument with them about it.
Quite right too. I mean, if it's a period piece, you don't, you know.
Yeah.
No one expects, if we were writing something medieval or whatever, you're not expected to write in Oldie English or Chaucerian language.
No.
But at the same time, it's got to be different, right, from how people speak now. And I get it when I see a period piece and someone says, hey, you guys, that's great.
Yeah. Well, a great example for me is the Willow TV series.
Oh yeah, yeah,
like,
absolutely.
The modern the young cast in that, they were all like, "Hey guys," and it was like, "What are you doing? Going to the mall?" and then you got Warwick Davis with "thee, thou, and thou" in it up a bit, and it was just so jarring. It just didn't. Oh, it just so strange.
Yeah, you got to go one way or the other, and I realise it can sound cheesy when you have all that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah, well, you don't need to go full on foldy roldy radio day, do you? You know what I mean? But just having it's the turn of phrase, isn't it? Like the structure of sentences is different.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to, you know, like I say, it doesn't have to be all
nonny nonny.
Hey nonny nonny, but it just needs to sound vaguely authentic, I think. Yeah. It was like for example, if you were writing a story set in Arthurian times and you had like Sir Gawain turn up and go, you know, "Hey guys,
how's it hanging, dudes?
How's it hanging?" It'd just be weird, wouldn't it? Right?
Unless it was Bill and Ted. Yeah.
Oh, Bill and Ted go to the Court of King Arthur. That'd be hilarious, wouldn't it? Whoa!
So crates, that always cracked me up. So crates, dude. Now, speaking of films, actually, this is you spoke about serendipity or synchronicity. Just a week back, I noticed on one of our TV channels was showing a film called The Ghoul, starring Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
From 1933.
Classic.
I didn't actually get the chance to watch it at the time, but it's on the list. So my brain naturally thought, 1930s. Was this an influence on the story, or did the story influence this film? It turns out neither.
Yeah.
Because this was based on a book by an author called Frank King, who I have to say I'd never heard of before. But he wrote quite a number of books, sometimes under the pen name of Clive Conrad. And he was an English doctor. And the book, The Ghoul, was turned into a film, but also a play as well. It was written in 1928. It's quite a different story. I think it centres around an ancient jewel that is stolen. I think that's like an Egyptologist kind of guy.
Yeah, it's an Egyptologist. It's more of a mummy story. Basically, it's a stolen jewel, and it does actually. It's a great film. It's a great film. I've seen it a lot over the years. And it actually, in my opinion, has one of the best jump scares in cinema.
Oh, wow.
Because there's only one in the entire film, and the build up to it is about 5 minutes long.
Oh.
And it's silent, and then it happens, and once it happens, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Nice.
So,
I should look forward to watching that. I was surprised I've not seen that, but it was actually it was thought to be a lost film for quite some time.
Yeah.
And I think there was a print that had some bits missing and was in quite bad shape. But in the 1980s, they were clearing out Shepperton Film Studios, the film vaults, and someone moved. There's a big pile of lumber that someone moved, and they found a door behind it. This is like a story in itself, you know.
It is, yeah.
And within that vault, they found a number of films and tapes and everything else, including this one, which was a quite a decent print, I understand.
Yeah, I think that's when I first saw it, when they released the print after they cleaned it up and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I seem to remember it having a bit of a hoopla around it and being shown on like late night Channel 4 or like midnight, you know, sort of thing. And it was like a big deal. And I remember my granddad being very excited. You know, it was a couple of years before he died, but he got very excited about it and got his brown ale in and sat up waiting for it. Sat in the dark watching it.
Nice. Waiting for Boris.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I think they might have put it out on DVD at some point as well. I've got a feeling I saw a reference.
They have, yeah, several times. I've got a copy of. It's a DVD. It's one of those doubles.
Oh yeah.
You often get with black and white films because they don't take up much space, and it's a double with the classic Lugosi White Zombie. So it's the Ghoul and White Zombie. Yeah,
that's worth getting. And now, as you may well know, regular listeners, Tim is something of an aficionado, an expert even, in a very specifically British genre of film. And Tim is, in fact, the man responsible for the collection entitled The Nookie-Nomicon, Lovecraft series in a carry-on vein. And I was both surprised and delighted to hear that there was, well, pretty much a carry-on version of the Ghoul as well.
Yeah. It's called What a Carve Up, 1961, is it? I think
61. Yeah.
You know, Sid James and Kenneth Connor, a lot of the original carry-on team, actually, the original lot. Interestingly, one of the carry-on films, I can't remember which one. I think it maybe Don't Lose Your Head. But there's a bit where, like, there's been some soldiers or whatever, and they've all fallen down and all the rest of it. And Sid actually turns to the camera and says, "What a carve up!"
Oh, nice, an Easter egg.
Yeah, there's an Easter egg. I need to go through my carry-on movies and find out which one it is that has the Easter egg. Yeah.
So I have no memory of seeing this film, so we've certainly got that lined up. I think it's on YouTube as well. You sent me the link over. Yeah.
There's a colorized version on YouTube.
Oh, right.
Because it was originally black and white, but there's been a color print. Yeah.
And the American title was "There's No Place Like Homicide."
Oh,
which is a bit of a rough pun, isn't it? But...
dearie me.
No place like homicide. No place like homicide. Yeah.
It's almost like the Anarchy in the UK rhyming thing, isn't it? Antichrist, Anarchist. Yeah, it always makes me wince, that one. Great song, but come on, Johnny.
Yeah. Come on, Johnny. So there we are. That's the Ghoul. That's our first story today. And the pace doesn't let up, because next we're looking at The Kingdom of the Worm, which is a great title, and it thoroughly delivers on that title as well.
Yeah, it's a stunning story. There's no hyperbole there. I absolutely love it. Never read it before. Brilliant. It was originally titled A Tale of Sir John Maundeville. Now, I wasn't that familiar with this, but Sir John Mandeville, or Maundeville, as Smith preferred, was a 15th century English knight. And there was a book really written between 1357 and 1371 that purports to be the travel memoir of Sir John Mandeville across the Islamic world as far as India and China, and that's entitled The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. It's almost a bit Munchausen, isn't it? Marco Polo kind of thing. Yeah. It's like a travelogue. And it was the earliest surviving text is in French, and it was translated into many other languages and acquired extraordinary popularity, which again is surprising. I've not read it, to be honest. Despite the extremely unreliable and often fantastical nature of the travels it describes, it was used as a work of reference. Christopher Columbus, for example, was heavily influenced by this and obviously Marco Polo's travels. According to the book, Mandeville crossed the sea in 1322 and basically traveled all over Turkey, Tartary, Persia, Syria, Arabia, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, you name it. The guy got about of it, you know?
And I thought it was interesting looking at this because one site said this book was sort of expanded and people made additions. It's almost like Lovecraftian in that sense, that people bolted their own bits on.
Yeah.
And they said it became not so much as a book as a genre in itself, which I thought was great.
Yeah. I mean, what it reminds me of, actually, from what little bits I'm obviously doing some research on it actually reminds me of the Gawain and the Green Knight.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And because that was basically a travelogue of him. He made this thing. He's got to go and keep his end of the bargain. But he travels all the way through Wales, you know, and up into Yorkshire. And on the way, he meets a dragon, and on the and structurally, it reminds me of that. And interestingly, they're both originally French.
And in the book, Sir John Mandeville, in the opening, is described as a knight from St Albans, which isn't too far down the road from here. But there's no contemporary mentions of him, and it seems he is a fictional character. Again, that strikes me as kind of Lovecraftian, a book invented or written by a fictional character of these supposedly true life adventures. It's that blending of the real and the fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the Necronomicon all over again, isn't it? The fact that Columbus took it as a reference book, you know, it's really, really, really interesting stuff. And and as you would imagine, Lovecraft and Smith were really into it.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, didn't Lovecraft have a copy of it, or I think one of them had a copy. Yeah.
Yes, he did. Yeah. Lovecraft actually wrote to Smith saying, "Your Maundeville tale packed a great kick for me, because that description of Abchaz and the zone of darkness had struck persistently in my memory ever since the first reading of Sir John. You have certainly developed the idea with tremendous effectiveness, and in a manner worthy of the wandering knight himself. I hope Wright will take this. It is both weird and oriental, but one can never tell about Brother Farnsworth. Anchar surely surpasses Averoy in potency of terror and ought to be good for a whole series of tales."
I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark here and guess that Farnsworth rejected it.
Well, it was completed between the 16th and the 18th of November 1930. And yeah, Farnsworth Wright rejected it for both, saying that interesting, but there is very little plot to it. In fact, I might almost say that there is no plot at all.
Oh, my God.
Now, as you can imagine, this rejection irked Smith considerably. And in a discussion with Lovecraft, he again complained about his capricious editorial policy and said that certainly Wright has turned down some of my best stories, The Door to Saturn and A Tale of Sir John Maundeville being notable instances. So Smith liked it, and he was really kind of put out that it didn't get published by him. And again, like the Ghoul, it never got printed properly. It went to a fantasy fan.
Wow.
So it ended up in a fanzine in October 1933. So again, he never got paid for it.
Yeah, and it's sort of disappeared without trace since then. I've certainly never read this one before, seen it anywhere.
Well, I think the typescript got lost for a long time. The typescript held by the estate differs from the version published. So there may have been editorial tampering with it, and the only way to ensure it getting published sort of thing. So for a while, it wasn't known which one's which, pretty much. But the version we're going off is the real deal. So the real deal, the prop, it's quite a long passage. I'm not going to go into it. I mean, too deeply. It's probably something we could cover at some point when we talk about the effort gone into these volumes, because it's tremendous. But for now, there was a lot of going through drafts and typescripts and bits and bobs trying to find the right version. So there we go.
And that, again, we should say, is down to the efforts of Scott Connors and Ron Hilger, who edited these amazing work.
Yeah, they're tremendous volumes. They really are. I can't say enough good things about them, to be fair.
So for this story, we're situated in the South Caucasus by the Black Sea, and we get mentions of these places, Abchaz and Hanasan. Hanasan is called the Land of Darkness, or was known as the Land of Darkness, as described in Maundeville's book. And our knight, Sir John Maundeville, is sort of passing by these kingdoms and heading for Georgia. And he's got 2 Armenian Christians with him as sort of his retinue, or I don't know. Actually, if he was a knight, would they be like his squires kind of thing, or are they just bearers, perhaps, or guides?
Yeah, probably squires, I'd say.
Retinue sort of implies squires, doesn't it?
Retinue, yeah, it does, yeah. A knight would have a squire, right? You know.
And they start hearing a lot of stories about how bad this place is. And they've even seen the river that flows out from Hanasan, a land of hostile idolaters on which there lay the curse of perpetual darkness, and wherein it was told the voices of people, the crowing of cocks, and the neighing of horses had sometimes been heard by those who approached its confines. That's quite a spooky one, isn't it? There's this land that's totally dark, and there's just these potentially quite disturbing noises coming out of it. Would you go in to investigate?
Yeah. Again, it's almost it's like Malneon and things like that. It's almost like a liminal place, isn't it?
And I guess the biggest parallel for me for this one was the Abominations of Yondo.
Yes,
it's got that kind of feel to it. But this is not an alien planet. We're in we're in sort of Eastern Europe, really, or this is where Europe meets Asia, isn't it? It's that part of the world.
Yes.
So it's not going to go into the Land of Darkness, but he begins to hear about a place that's even worse than Abchaz, a dread domain named Anchar, which lies before him on the road to Georgia. And these tales are vague and frightful. And some said this country was a desolation peopled only by the liches of the dead and by loathly phantoms. Others that it was subject to the ghouls and afrits who devoured the dead and would suffer no living mortal to trespass upon their dominions. And still others spoke of things all too hideous to be described, and of dire necromancies that prevailed, even as the might of emperors doth prevail in more usually ordered lands. So overall, not good reviews on TripAdvisor.
No. That's tickled me for some reason. Yeah.
We went there expecting a nice holiday on the shores of the Black Sea, and we found it was ruled over by a necromantic lich king.
Yeah. And a bunch of ghouls.
My wife was very upset.
The ghoul behind the bar. Yeah, and the good knight listened gravely to all these tales, as was his wont, but being a stout Christian and valorous withal, he would not suffer them to deter him from his purpose. So even when the last inhabited village had been left behind, and he came to the division of the ways, and saw verily that the highway into Anchar had not been trodden by man or beast for generations, he refused to change his intention, and rode forward stoutly, while the Armenians followed with much protest and some trepidation.
This is our good old trope again, isn't it? Of the locals, no, tell him not to go, and the bearers or the guides or the companions who are reasonably local also tell him not to go. But being the stout Christian man that he is going to press on regardless.
Yeah.
Do you think he's got a medieval pith helmet on? This guy.
Tweed under his chainmail.
Yeah. I'm Sir John Bloody Maundeville. I go where I please.
Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah.
Having said that, he does have to agree that the place does look a little bit odd. And I really like this expression. So there's no trees, no herbs, no lichens, nothing that would grow in any wholesome land, but low hills mottled with a leprosy of salt. Isn't that great?
That is great, yeah.
And ridges bare as the bones of the dead. So even on the outskirts, it's kind of a desolation.
Yeah, it's a very visual tale again. I think that's why I really like it. The atmosphere, it's cloying, isn't it? It's you can always smell the decay.
And it's one of those that starts bad and just gets worse and worse, isn't it?
Yeah,
as far as
really is. Yeah. This next bit, because he's passing the cliff, came to pass the hills are straight and steep on each hand, with pinnacle cliffs of dark stone. And he talks here about the stones taking shapes and forms. Now, there's that forest outside of France, de Forêt de Fontainebleau, which I used in my Musketeers versus Cthulhu story. And that's famous for scaring the crap out of travelers at night because the rocks all look like savage beasts.
Oh, I remember us talking about that before. Yeah.
That's what this brought to mind. It's that same thing of, when you see things like enshrouded in shadow, it looks like a crouching lion or something. And it's just a rock.
Yeah. And I can see that. We spent the weekend just gone at the Wright Stones, which incidentally I've put up as an Innsmouth excursion on our YouTube channel. You might like to check out.
Oh, nice.
And it was mainly the Kingstone. The approach to that was quite odd. You go up this little windy path and it looks like a figure standing at the top of it. That was quite an odd one. The other stones are all quite small, but that does have that. If you didn't know it was there, you weren't expecting it. It'd be, oh, it's almost like a strange hooded figure sort of standing there,
I think that's the one that they used to great effect in the Stones of Blood, the Doctor Who serial from the 70s. Yeah.
Yes, they did. Yes, Tom Baker. Yeah, it was a stand-in for Cornwall.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah, but it's more than just shapes because there's faces in the stone and they appear to move and twist as the travellers go by. And he describes them as looking like ghouls or goblins or others having the features of heathen idols, uncouth and hideous to behold. And others still that were like the worm-gnawed visages of the dead. And these also appeared to repeat themselves on every hand in a doubtful and wildering fashion. And then I have to say it, I'm sorry, I apologise in advance. The Armenians would have turned back, for they swore that the rocks were alive and endowed with motion. The rocks are alive and endowed with motion.
Oh, brilliant. These two stories, we could do an entire cover album of ridiculous versions. We've got ghouls on film, the rocks are alive, I kissed a ghoul. I kissed a ghoul and I liked it.
Big ghouls don't cry.
Oh God.
It's our reaction, folks, to the horror. Indeed. We alleviate horror by humour.
It's a very British thing, isn't it? Something awful happens. What's the first thing you do? Make a really bad pun.
Make a joke or call someone a wanker.
Pretty much, yeah.
So the Armenians, of course, are getting more and more nervous, but Sir John presses on. Follow me, he says, and you will, and rode on among the rocks and pinnacles. So now we're into this ancient road covered with dust, or an unused road covered with dust, and they saw the tracks of a creature that was neither man nor any terrestrial beast, and the tracks were of such unwanted shape and number, and were so monstrous that even Sir John was disquieted. And that's it. You don't get they don't see this beast anywhere. There's no description of the tracks. But it's very unsettling, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. And your mind, like my brain was just coming up with all kinds of weird and wonderful abominations, especially knowing like Smith's track record of very alien aliens. So you can just imagine what was in his head at the time when he wrote about it, Yeah. And basically they carry on through they go into some trees that are all sort of weird and twisted and bring to mind the Donald Wandrei story. And then in the deepest, darkest depths of the ravine, Sir John and his followers meet a solitary jackal, which fled them not in the manner of its kind, but passed them with articulate words in a voice hollow and sepulchral as that of a demon, bidding them to turn back, since the land before them was an interdicted realm, All were much startled thereat, considering that this was indeed a thing of enchantment, for a jackal to speak thus, and being against nature, was foreominous of ill and peril. Yeah, you would kind of lose control of your bowels at that point if a jackal came up to you and sort of went, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, indeed, and that's it for the Armenians, right? They're out.
Yeah, they're out. They're gone.
They're at the end of their tether, and they flee. And even Sir John is disturbed by this as well, and the fact that his retinue have abandoned him. But trusting in our Saviour to forfend him against all harmful enchantments and the necromancies of Satan, he rode on until he reaches a grey plain that was like the ashes of some dead land under extinguished heavens. Again, lovely imagery. Well, descriptive imagery, maybe not lovely.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of, there's a couple of things here in this story. One was the Planet of the Apes, did they call it the Forbidden Zone or the Wasteland kind of thing?
Yeah,
it's like the sort of radioactive waste. That's
the Forbidden Zone, I think it was.
And there's also, if any of you out there play Conan Exiles, then you'll know at the centre of the map there's a vast sort of necropolis that's half buried in the sand.
Oh, awesome.
And is populated by skeletons and liches and that kind of thing. I think it might be called the City of the Dead off the top of my head. I'm sure someone will know the proper name. But very much that impression of these buildings at sort of crazy angles peeking out of the sands. Yeah,
it's a great image. It also reminded me of Skaro, the planet of the Daleks, which is described specifically from the first ever Dalek serial. And the episode is called The Planet of the Dead. And that's got all these sort of petrified trees that look like men and, all this weird and wonderful flora and fauna that's just dead, And
that's kind of what we get here, isn't it? Because they have this plain, but then we get bones of men, horses and camels, which have marked the way with their pitiable whiteness. We get the topmost branches of long dead trees arose like supplicative arms from the sand. And we get ruinous houses with doors open to the high drifting desert and mausoleums sinking slowly in the dunes. So very much that image of desertion and decay. And then we meet the horned viper.
Indeed, yeah. Cerastes. Yeah. In the Greek myth, I love that image. Yeah, it's a very lithe serpent that can bend and twist itself into all manner of shapes and cracks and crannies. But it's got the horns of a ram.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So when they discovered the horned viper out in Africa, they named it Cerastes. So that's where that comes from. Yeah.
And this is also a talking animal. And again, it warns him not to go on, for this is a realm forbidden to all mortal beings except the dead.
Makes you wonder if somebody'd slipped something in his water, doesn't it? It's like a bad acid trip.
You think this is an unreliable narrator situation, perhaps?
Very possibly.
But Sir John is made of stern stuff, isn't he? So he addresses himself in prayer, and he knows surely that he had arrived in a place that was subject to satanical dominion. There's an album name.
Yeah. Like Norwegian black metal band or something, the corpse paint. You can just see it, can't you?
And as he's praying, the gloom begins to thicken. It's as though night is falling, though there aren't any stars or anything. There's just this gloom. And from that twilight that was nigh to darkness, there came gigantic figures, muffled and silent, and having, as he thought, neither mouths nor eyes, beneath the brow folds of their sable cerements. So I got the impression of almost like these large sort of mummies or something like that, or wrapped in, it's that tattered rag idea again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tattered shrouds, perhaps. And they basically pick him up off his horse in fleshless hands and carry him off. And this was quite disturbing because you think, oh no, not the horse. He heard no sound as he went, other than the screaming of his horse far off, like a soul in mortal dread and agony.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice bit here that that they uttered no word, nor that Sir John couldn't speak, in the fear that came upon him, and likewise he was powerless to draw his sword. It's like he's been stricken by this terror. It's that's very Lovecraftian, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like this man, this tough chap, it's something so terrible that it's just completely shot him down.
Yeah, because it talks about his faintness, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost like a fugue state, isn't it?
And I like that idea, or this description of it as a coldness blowing upon him, but without the whisper of wind.
Mm.
And the air he breathed was dense with corruption and such odours as may emanate from a broken charnel. Well, we've got to get charnel in a story like this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, there's this idea, perhaps almost the coldness of death has touched him. And that's part of this paralysing effect. And he sees that they've carried him off to a sort of town. There's streets, there's high mansions and thoroughfares and markets. And amidst all that, a building that bears the appearance of a great palace with a facade that glimmered vaguely and domes and turrets half swallowed up by the lowering darkness. But there is a light coming from this place.
Cast obscurely through open doors and between broad-spaced pillars, too feeble was the light for torch or cresset, too dim for any lamp, and Sir John marvelled amidst his faintness and terror. But when he had drawn closer still, he saw that the strange gleaming was like the phosphor bred by the putrefaction of a charnel. Yeah, corpse lights. Brilliant.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? Because you think it's not like a warm, welcoming glow, of torchlight or firelight or something. It's the illumination of decay. But this is obviously the remnants of an old but this is obviously the remnants of an ancient civilization and quite advanced and opulent civilization, because we get this description of the palace. It's got carven columns and ornate furniture. The opulence of kings was manifest, and thence he came into a great audience room with a throne of gold and ebony set on a high dais, all of which was illumined by no other light than the glimmering of decay. So this is somewhere that was highly civilized at one time.
Mm.
And again, that's a Smith trope, right?
Yeah.
The death of civilizations, the decay. Yeah.
Yeah, it probably went through a period of decadence and into ruin. That's the sort of Smith thing, isn't it? Civilization, decadence, ruin.
Yeah.
That's the Smith life cycle almost, isn't it?
And then the necromancers take over.
Well,
not exactly a necromancer, this one, but what's that on the throne, Tim?
I absolutely love this. And the throne was tenanted, not by any human lord or sultan, but by a grey, prodigious creature of a height and bulk exceeding those of man, and having in all its over-swollen form the exact similitude of a charnel worm.
Oh,
it's a great big fat worm.
It's a great big maggoty thing sitting on the throne.
Yeah. And somewhere Robert W. Chambers punched the air.
And it kind of gets worse because, again, that's like I said earlier, this idea of you start with a bad situation and it gets worse and worse. Because as we might expect, the two other animals we've seen that look fairly normal, I guess, for their type, but they spoke.
Yeah.
But this worm looks at him, and I love this description as well. So John became aware that the worm was scrutinizing him severely, with little eyes deep folded in the obscene bloating of its face. And then, with a dreadful and solemn voice, it addressed him. So this thing has got a type of face, and it reminded me of the festival where the cowled congregation, or the people with masks and all that.
Ah, yeah.
They are things that ought to crawl, that have learnt to walk.
Yeah.
It's very much that worm in human form idea, isn't it, again?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think that's why Chambers sprang instantly to mind. It's from the yellow sign, the gravekeeper, the guy with the worm fingers. Yeah.
Yes, his finger came off.
Yeah.
His finger came right off.
Indeed.
So, I wonder if they're both drawing on Chambers there, and I wonder if Smith drew on Lovecraft from the festival as
possibly,
well.
Yeah.
Because Smith Smith does use the giant maggot or giant worm a few times, doesn't he?
Well, the great ghoul, his creation, Mordigian,
Yes. Yeah.
is basically a great big grave worm that commands the ghouls. So, yeah.
And the worm introduces itself as the king of Anchar by virtue of having conquered and devoured the mortal ruler thereof, as well as all those who were his subjects. So there's a little hint of Poe there, isn't there, with the conqueror worm? That's got to be a nod, isn't it, that?
Yeah, I was just about to say, yeah. It has to be. It's, it's that thing, isn't it? The only two inevitabilities, death and taxes. The worm conquers all.
Yeah, and I think that is what it means by conquered here. He's not come in and sort of had a fight and invaded the city, but
no,
obviously at some point we're all going to meet the worm.
Exactly.
The worm has the last word. It's not the bird is the word, the worm is the bird. But then the early bird catches the worm. So I'm tying myself up in circles.
Oh, God. You're making my head hurt. You give me a nosebleed.
And the worm sort of lays down the law here. He says, look, now listen here. You were told not to come here. You were warned, not only by the people outside of the land, but the jackal told you, the viper told you, but still you insisted on coming in. Thy temerity hath earned a condign punishment, and before I suffer thee to go hence, I decree that thou shalt lie for a term among the dead, and dwell as they dwell in the dark sepulchre, and learn the manner of their abiding, and the things which none should behold with living eyes. So basically he's been condemned to a living death for an unknown period of time.
Yeah. Yea, still alive, it shall be thine to descend and remain in the very midst of death and putrefaction for such length of time as seemeth meet to correct thy folly and punish thy presumption. Yeah, that is a fate, isn't it?
Yes, you say a fate worse than death. That's a fate with death, isn't it? To be sealed in a tomb with whatever is in there, basically. And even though we know Sir John is a brave and valorous knight, but even he sort of, I get the impression his knees give way a bit here. He falls into a bit of a swoon where he's grabbed again by those giant figures. And this time is carried off somewhere in the outer darkness in a place of tombs and graves and cenotaphs beyond the dim town. He was flung into a deep sepulchre of stone, and the brazen door of the sepulchre was closed upon him. You can hear that clang, can't you? That echo in.
Yeah. Hollow echo. Yeah. Yeah. Lying there through the seasonless midnight, Sir John was companioned only by an unseen cadaver and by those ministrants of decay who were not yet wholly done with their appointed task. So this corpse is being eaten as he's sitting there.
Yes.
There's maggots squirming all over it.
And didn't you think I think that could be the best band name we've had yet, the Ministrants of Decay. I think I
love it.
That's the top band name.
It's a great one, isn't it? There's so many in this story, though.
And I like this, that all he can hear is the beating of his heart, which, and I suppose there's another little Poe reference here. It sounds like his heart is getting louder and louder till he's almost deafened by the beating of his own heart. And all he's got for company is this thing that lays in perpetual silence next to him. Yeah.
So obviously he fails his SAN roll, basically, doesn't he?
He fails his SAN roll. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and he realizes that the whole point of this was him to learn the voidness of death, to share the abomination of desolation. Abomination of Desolation, there's another band name. And to comprehend the unutterable mysteries of corruption. Yeah, that's a learning curve and a half, isn't it?
And then we get this nice little gruesome, grisly detail. His flesh crept and his spirit cringed within him as he felt the crawling of worms that went avidly to the dwindling corpse or came away in glutted slowness.
Bloated grave worms, lovely.
And he's got no way of telling how long he's there. It might be hours, it might be days. I presume he's not there for weeks, or he'd starve or die of thirst kind of thing. Or would he starve?
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, unless he, maybe he becomes a ghoul, you never know.
And then Sir John was aware of a sullen clangour and knew that the brazen door had been opened. And now we get this nice little detail. For the first time, by the dimness of twilight that had entered the tomb, he saw in all its piteousness and repulsion the thing with which he had abode so long. In the sickness that fell upon him at this sight, he was howled forth from the sepulchre by those who had thrust him therein. Now, this reminded me of something, and for some reason I thought of Papillon, but it might not have been that. A story or part of a story where a guy was locked in a cell in darkness, and he was sort of left a bit like an oubliette type setup. And he could kind of feel things around him, and that same idea, he could feel things moving. But it wasn't until they came and opened the cell door and let some light in that he saw basically it was just a pile of worms and maggots and stuff sharing the cell with him. So I don't know, I can't believe I just made that up off the top of my head sort of thing. I'm sure I read that from somewhere. So if anyone out there, I did read Papillon, but it was many years ago. Perhaps one of our listeners can enlighten me onto that, or perhaps you'd rather forget I even mentioned it because it's a horrible image.
Yeah, he basically leaves and is led through Antchar along the road whereby he had come into that dolorous realm. There's another band name.
Dolorous realm, yeah.
Yes, he's led off by the same retinue that brought him the first time, these sort of shuffling cadavers.
And it's nice because he finds his horse again. So the horse is okay. I was quite pleased by that.
Yeah.
And he rides off. And in fact, when he comes back onto the northern road, he joins up again with his Armenian retinue, who they were waiting for him. They thought they'd wait around for him, which was nice, I thought.
Yeah. It's not like in the Tree Men and the Robert Bloch story, where they were just like, that's it, we're off.
Yeah, they were waiting for him and they were praying for his secure deliverance. So perhaps their prayers had some effect, who knows. And then we get the final paragraph. Long afterwards, when he had returned from his wayfaring in the east and among the peoples of remote isles, he told of the kingdom of Abchaz in the book that related his travels. And he also wrote therein concerning the province of Hanison, but he made no mention of Antchar, that kingdom of darkness and decay ruled by the throned worm.
Awesome.
I like this, that Smith took something that was, let's call it a fantasy novel, for want of a better word, a story of this strange place, and sort of thought, yeah, that's good, but it's not strange enough. So what else would he have seen that was even weirder? What would he have seen that was so strange and weird he refused to write about it? He didn't want to tell people about it.
It's interesting because, like I say, I haven't read this, but a couple of years ago, I wrote a story for an anthology called Shadow over Avalon, which was Arthurian Cthulhu mythos tales. And I decided, because we mentioned about Gawain and the Green Knight, there was all this stuff sort of alluded to. And I thought, well, what about if? And I created a village and he went there. And the village was called Geetha Vale, which is Welsh for Goat's Vale. So that gives you some indication of what he meets there, right? So there's all kinds of tentacled horrors and all kinds of stuff. And at the end of it, I kind of put that I'll tell Arthur about the dragon, but he'd never believe what happened in Geetha Vale, sort of thing. So it's interesting that I kind of did the same thing.
Nice. That's a nice idea and a nice mechanic to use, isn't it? Yeah. And something we've spoken about and is a thing with Lovecraftian tales. Sometimes you take the accepted mythology, but then you peel that away to reveal the actual Lovecraftian truth underneath it. You know,
indeed, yeah.
So yeah, that's an excellent story. I mean, that's one of my favourites out of everything we've read so far.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? It's just the atmosphere. It's just, really good.
I mean, as for plot, a guy goes to a place and he ends up chatting to a giant grave worm and gets entombed in a crypt and eventually freed. What more plot do you want? What do you want? A car chase or something? I mean, helicopter gun battle.
But again, it's got that cautionary tale like thing going on. It could be an Aesop's fable or a Grimm's fairy tale. It's got that same kind of thing. It's almost like, don't be a cocky arse. If somebody warns you not to go places, there's probably a damn good reason. You almost want the worm to say, let that be a lesson to you at the end, you know?
And again, like we said before, that's something we see across M.R. James and everything else.
M.R. James, very much warning to the curious and all that. Yeah.
This could almost be Jamesian in some aspects of it. You could see this if you sort of transplanted this into a remote English location.
Yes. Yeah.
With the questing scholar who ignores all the warnings.
Yeah.
You could almost see that.
Finds an old deserted chapel,
Yeah. The Chapel of the Worm.
There you go.
There's another story to write.
There's another one to write, yeah.
So, yes, thoroughly enjoyable.
Yeah.
Do let us know what you think, dear listener. I don't know to my mind, that's a very visual story, so I think it would be great as a TV or film adaptation. I'm not sure how they'd work that one exactly. You could certainly see that with CGI these days. That wouldn't be an issue, would it? A giant talking grave worm.
Yeah, a giant talking grave worm.
I guess the issue there was you've got the guy shut in darkness for a certain period of time. That's not a very exciting thing to see on screen, is it?
No, I suppose not. But you can, I don't know. Also reminded me a little bit of, the Curse of Yig. At the end of that in the cabin.
Yeah,
where it's all in darkness and the body, and you've just got the squirming of snakes and stuff. It's deeply unsettling, but I don't know how well it translates to a visual medium.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It put me in mind a bit of The Outsider as well.
Yes, yeah.
That's like almost that's where The Outsider grew up. Kind of that kind of feel, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of living among the dead things. And wasn't there an implication in The Outsider of being taught things, taught how to read by something,
Yeah.
So I think although people won't say that's a Lovecraftian tale as such, it's certainly not really mythos. But I think in stories like that and The Outsider, we see the crossover between Smith and Lovecraft.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which I suppose owes a lot to Poe as well, really.
Yeah, it's Gothic, isn't it? It's Poe, it's Chambers, it's,
Yeah. Now, we mentioned earlier about getting in touch with the show and that we've been receiving messages. We've been receiving some very good messages and feedback lately. And I understand we have something in from our friend Ulrich again.
Indeed, yeah, from Ulrich Duvetta. We have another wonderful episode. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Some things I wrote down while listening. Playing copious amounts of Diablo and similar RPGs has expanded my vocabulary of swords, shields, and armors to the extent that I was not surprised to have heard of a Yataghan before. Yeah, now you come to mention it. Yeah, I first heard the word collops in a Discworld novel. Ah, that's interesting.
Oh, wow, I must have missed that one.
Pratchett used it, right. But I thought it was something else, more like offal or organ meat, so, that's tripe, that kind of.
That's the impression I had, yeah.
Yeah. And I've got the painting that caused house fires, heard about in, he thinks from Carl's Diary in a Ricky Gervais show episode. It referenced the crying boy painting. And yes, that's exactly what you were thinking of, isn't it? The crying boy.
Yeah, well, the one I was thinking of was that I think she's called the Spanish Lady or something like that, which I put a link up to. That was that one that was in every house in the 70s or
Indeed,
whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought the curse was associated with that, but it is associated with the crying boy.
Yeah, it's the crying boy.
Yeah. And yeah, Ulrich, I agree with your things on terms of weaponry in there. I think back to Dungeons and Dragons. I think my favourite was the Bohemian ear spoon, which is a type of polearm.
That's brilliant.
That's a great name for a weapon, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where you get to learn the difference between your halberds and your glaives and your poleaxes and your Bohemian ear spoons and all the rest of it.
Yeah, Elder Scrolls is good for that as well. For all the, you end up with an inventory full of all these weird and wonderful daggers and swords, and with weird and wonderful names to go with them.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. It adds flavour, doesn't it?
It
adds
does.
colour to
It
the
does.
story, rather than
Yeah.
just saying he's got a knife.
A curved dagger. Yeah.
No, he's got a poniard or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
A main gauche.
Sounds like a fruit.
Have a portion of main gauche
Yeah.
with ice cream.
Now, I believe we have another comment.
Yes, it's from our good friend Miguel Fliguer, because we mentioned last time about both stories were centered around this idea of affairs or love triangles gone wrong.
Yeah.
And Miguel asks, does the old Whately Lavinia Yog-Sothoth triangle count as an extramarital affair gone wrong? I know.
That made me chuckle, that did.
I'm not sure that it went wrong, really, or did it go right? I mean,
No. I think that he got the desired effect, I think. Some kind of abomination on the hill.
yeah, I think it was Wilbur that went wrong by getting eaten by a dog, basically, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, basically Wilbur screwed everything up.
Yeah.
If he hadn't been such a numpty, it had all gone right, wouldn't it?
It always disappoints me. That's my one disappointment in that story, that such a great character as Wilbur just got taken out by a guard dog.
Yeah, it's a bit anticlimactic, isn't it? You should at least get him hosed down with lead or something,
Flamethrower.
Although that's not very Lovecraftian, but you know what I mean.
It led, motherfucker.
Yeah, like Dick Tracy with a Tommy gun. Yeah,
but yes, I suppose that does count as an extramarital something. Though,
yeah.
I don't want to delve any further into.
And by the same token, you got the Great God Pan as well, haven't you?
Yes, well, that was Lovecraft's primary influence, wasn't it?
Indeed,
in terms of the setting and in some ways the plot as well, really.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So, on that decidedly disturbing note, I think we'll call a halt to today's proceedings. Thanks very much for listening. Do keep your questions and comments and suggestions coming in. As I say, we'll put a link up to the new Discord server below, so we hope to meet you in there for a chat. We are, at some point in the near future, going to be doing a sort of open chat session for our patrons, where you'll get a chance to speak to us live and ask questions and make puns and whatever you like, whatever you
join the insanity. Yeah.
And to become a patron, well, you can now subscribe to our first tier of patronage on Buzzsprout, and you can subscribe to the other 2 tiers on our Patreon site. And patrons at every level get access to bonus content for Strange Shadows and for the Innsmouth Book Club. You get a quarterly copy of Innsmouth News, and you also get a chance to vote for which stories we're going to be covering on the Innsmouth Book Club in our patron polls. At the higher tiers, you get some other things as well, like discount. We are in the process of setting up a merch shop. I've had a little bit of difficulty with that at the moment, so for some reason the Redbubble store won't open. So I'm just talking with Redbubble at the moment to try and get that up and running. Anyway, that's our issue, but hopefully we'll have a site up and running soon where we've got lots of nice t-shirt designs for the discerning Smithian or Lovecraftian.
Yeah. And I'll probably end up buying them all because that's what always happens with me.
So thanks again for listening, folks. We do hope you can join us next time for the next story. What are we covering next time, Tim?
I believe next time we are covering An Adventure in Futurity, which is something, again, I haven't read.
No, and that's a much longer story as well, I believe.
Yeah, some novelette or short novella length. I think it's technically a novelette.
Good, so we look forward to that. Hope you can join us. Thanks again for listening, folks. Thanks to all our existing patrons and subscribers. We do appreciate your support. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Point.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.